Now, we're going to hear from our first entrepreneur. If we can please have Demian Willette from Species Track.
Good evening. I want to start by asking, what is this? Now, some of you may say that's sushi, and you're correct. But what if I told you here in Los Angeles, 47% of the sushi my lab has sampled has been mislabeled? What if I told you this was also not unique to Los Angeles, but something we find across the United States? And this is not reserved just for the headlines. It's something we see in the science. Here above are a number of publications out of my lab that show a persistent problem of seafood mislabeling throughout the American supply chain. Now, what does this mean? Well, for the seafood industry, these failures in accurate labeling result in a loss of customer trust, complications in regulatory compliance, and a reduction of livelihood. For us, the consumers, there's inherent health risks, and at a societal level, challenges like illegal fishing. Globally, the cost for these challenges is $83 billion per year, and for just one seafood processor, fines upwards of $500,000. Now, my name is Demian Willette, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Species Tracks. I have more than 12 years of experience in fisheries and conservation genetics. I've lived in fishing villages across the world to see these challenges, and I've grown impatient waiting for this solution. I'm joined by my co-founder, Dr. Margarita Joaquin, our CTO, Amina Jackson, and our front-end developer, Yifan Hu. So what Species Tracks does is it builds customer trust and loyalty. It enhances a vendor's reputation while also easing regulatory compliance. It helps us combat illegal fishing and fraud while ultimately protecting the livelihood of those who follow the rules. Now, current solutions rely on trust and paper-based tracking. How Species Tracks works is we deploy our patented eDNA technology into the wastewater stream of a processor. From there, we can detect what species are present in a fraction of the time of conventional tools. And from there, we empower the vendor to decide, is this the Chilean sea bass that it says on the invoice, or is it the DNA telling us that it's Pacific halibut? From here, Species Tracks delivers accurate and impartial species identification that enables those vendors to quickly identify fraud in their supply chain, meet their responsible sourcing commitments, and capture that higher price point. Our business case is the US seafood industry, where we look to launch a subscription service, basically a kit, for seafood processors and the restaurants. Very excitingly, recently we were approached by the FDA. They've asked to license our technology, bring it in-house as part of their investigative tool suite, and we begin that pilot in a few weeks. So come help us grow, come help us discover our solutions. At this time, we're seeking partners in our beta testing and advisors in business and food industry. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay, so who has the first question? Carl.
What's the fidelity of the testing? Say if like there were two different species in there, can you determine ratios or anything like that?
Very good question. So in terms of the fidelity of the testing, we're 97%, 98% accurate in terms of identifying it to species level. This is vetted in over 12 years of testing when we've used traditional DNA tools. We've ramped that up to use within environmental DNA testing. The beautiful thing is we can use more than one genetic marker to look at different groups. So for example, tuna, which are really hard to distinguish, we can insert a different tool in the exact same pipeline that we use. So that allows us to customize based on need. For example, the FDA is most curious about identification of bacteria, Listeria, E. coli. So we can target those ones that are commonly concerned in food safety and drop in that and be able to test in that unique way.
Yeah, I was curious about the food safety portions. Like, what's the bigger problem? Is it that consumers in a sushi restaurant don't know what they're actually eating, or is there more of a fundamental health issue?
That's a great question. So there's two sides to this. So where we got started was looking at mislabeling in terms of seafood fraud. So there is a level in terms of the onus is on the seafood processor to show that the seafood that they're importing into the US and then sending through the supply chain is accurately labeled. So that's why we approach the processor or the importer as our target, and we can look at that on scale through this technology. We don't have to sample each individual piece of sushi like shown there. Rather, we can take the wastewater from the whole plant and identify it. In the same vein, as mentioned, we can just drop in a different genetic marker and look for those species that are of health concern, the Listeria, E. coli, and so forth. So although we started with the idea of tracing seafood, what we've learned through customer discovery, through our interactions with those who are looking early adopters of our technology, there's definitely space to develop this for food safety. And that's what we're really excited with this new pilot with the FDA.
Tulsi.
What are the costs associated with the R&D, and how does that, scale over time and decrease margins or increase margins?
Yeah, so I'm learning much of this in terms of we've just found the company a month ago and learning these things. But in terms of the scalability, I did show some numbers in terms of what we think it would cost for the subscription service as well as for the licensing of the technology. And I can go back here in terms of just some ballpark figures for those. I guess for the other part of your question in terms of scaling it up, so some of the components in it, such as our collection device that was staged, I put that here. These we actually designed this intentionally where we could quickly print these out on a 3D printer, which we have in-house, or we can market this, or this is what we have patented, and we can go with the manufacturer to go at scale much faster. Other components we're working on solidifying our supply chain, our suppliers, in terms of being able to grow at that. But right now, we're not at that point yet to scale. Yeah.
Just a question. So apart from food safety, what would be the other kind of main motivators for a vendor to do quality control, essentially?
Right. So consumers, through our customer discovery, one of the selling points is if you can speak to the sustainability of the fish that you're selling. And a lot of that is at the point of, well, first, what is it that we're eating? If you think it's Pacific halibut and it ends up being Atlantic halibut, that might not matter to many people, but there's a big difference in terms of the fishery. Are you buying Atlantic halibut, selling it as Pacific, and unintentionally putting pressure on a fishery that's already on its way out or in trouble? So that's part of where this goes, is the sustainability aspect, and where can we build those margins in the restaurants, in the processors, in terms of where they can get ahead of other supply sources. We're really excited because what we're looking at next is being able to, with the same technology, geolocate where the fish is from. So not just identify the species, but say this is off the coast of Spain or this is off the coast of Mexico. And we can use that from the same genetics we have using slightly different markers. And so imagine that. You can say and validate this is from a fishery that's well managed, that's sustainable. That gives a seafood restaurant, a processor, the space to argue that their food is sustainable.
Have you put any thought into, supply chains are always difficult nuts to crack in terms of push-pull dynamics? Do you think this is going to be more of a push down from a Whole Foods saying, I require this from my supply chain, or more from a bottom-up from processors?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We've explored different levels. Where does this fit in? And again, as mentioned, the burden is on the processors in terms of who has to comply with federal regulation. There actually was a piece of legislation that just went through the American Competes Act, which was going to require this sort of tracking throughout all fish into the US. They've pushed it back a little bit, so I think some of it's going to come from top down at the regulatory level, but then there's the consumers who want to see that their food is sustainably sourced. So where we see it fitting in best is right now our focus is in that mid-supply chain. But I envision within the coming years we're going to see more pressure from the top down in terms of regulatory. And that's here in the US. Yeah.
So on the regulatory side of things, with the licensing agreement that's in place, is that for something that in the future they're looking to potentially install this at all of those fisheries or others to then be able to monitor those? And are there subsequent types of fines if they are mislabeling type of fish that they get dinged with?
Yeah, so if you're from LA, on the signs outside of restaurants, it has the ABC in terms of the quality of it. As simple as that, we can see those indications of what the cost is mislabeling. It's there, but there's also fines. To go to your other question in terms of how this works, we see subscription as one stream in terms of processors aren't going to want to build a whole genetics lab inside their processing plant. But the idea from this actually came years ago. I received a Fulbright, and I was in Ecuador developing this technology. And we were getting samples and then driving several hours to a lab. This technology here fits into 2 suitcases. It's fully portable, and everything has been scaled, so now I can roll onto a fishing vessel into a processing plant and work at the speed, it said 12 hours, that's about how long it takes, at the speed of almost 1 working shift. So in terms of the industry, you have a shipment coming in, you can make a decision soon, very quickly, to decide if you're going to reject that. Currently, in terms of food safety, it's 3 to 7 days to wait for that test to come back. So I mentioned the speed of this, it's portable and it's quick. Now, not all of that, a lot of that is on the licensing side. Not everybody's going to want to build a lab. That's where the subscription side comes in.
Go ahead.
Well, my suggestion for your pitch, and I really like this area, and I'm only half joking, is if you have either blockchain or generative AI in there, you may increase your valuation substantially. But my serious question is, how do you actually validate and verify the tracking as it goes through the supply chain?
Right, so testing at multiple points. And I love your mention of blockchain because we've discussed that. Blockchain, once you put it in, largely you can't change the data as it goes through without modifiers. But we want to make sure that first data point into blockchain. So if a vendor wants to use blockchain, we test at the beginning, and based on something that's impartial like DNA, it's correct all the way through. So I agree, and we have some thoughts on AI too, but another time. Now I lost track of your other question.
Are you using blockchain?
No, we're not using blockchain yet. And I don't know if we will, but there's definitely synergies where we could work with them on that.
In the 50 seconds we have left, can you talk about your IP, whether you have a license, where it comes from, and what are the barriers to entry for other competitors?
Right, so we do have a bit about where we see our competitors with this differentiators. Our IP, we actually had the provisional. We just filed for our full 2 days ago on this device, and we have vision on our software that we're working on in terms of licensing that as well. So we started with one, and we're working our way through the rest of it. In terms of our competitors, we're working to move quickly and be the first to introduce these. One of our strengths is the industry partners that you see there at the bottom. A lot of this, we've received funding from the National Science Foundation and also work with a number of seafood industry to get us to that environment before others.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.